starting now. So last week we finished over here when we discussed the outputs of the create and update lessons learned register or manage the project knowledge. Really, that was the process. So today we're talking about the next process within the project integration knowledge area, and that's monitor and controlling project work. So for the inputs to this project, we have any components of the project management plan. So all of them, really, all the project plans, all the auxiliary plans, all the documents that are produced in the process of project management planning. So all those documents are inputs to monitoring and controlling, because these are the documents that will inform what we are checking and what kind of baselines we have, the specifications, and so on and so forth. Project documents, so there are documents that are auxiliary to the project management plan, but create a baseline and basis for monitoring and controlling. And those include, but they're not limited to, relate to those: assumption log, basis of estimates, cost forecasts, logs, issue logs, lessons learned, milestones, reports on quality, the risk register that's produced during the process of um, project risk management, forecasting, scheduling, and so on. The work performance information is an output from many other processes that will also inform us monitoring and controlling agreements between the stakeholders, EEFs and OPAs. Obviously, they come into almost all the processes that we have in the project management. And the tools and techniques that we're going to use is expert judgment. So I'll talk about this in a little bit. Data analysis techniques, which obviously include but are not limited to alternatives analysis, cost benefit, earned value, root cause, trend, variance. I would imagine that the earned value analysis, trend analysis, and variance analysis would be the most important ones for monitoring project work, as well as the control processes. So worth noting. Obviously, decision making and meetings are also going to be used in order to carry out the process. And for outputs of this process, once you monitor and control project work, we will produce work performance reports, requests to change project configuration. Let's say project management plan might be updated out as a result of this, and documents might be updated. Essentially, as I see this, the monitoring and controlling project work is that project should follow a path. So going from A to B should follow some sort of a path, going from the starting point to the end point, going from the project inception through the planning, and while the work is being carried out and performed. We want to make sure that what we're producing in the course of the project matches the requirements that the stakeholders put together for the project output. However, what you might discover is that in the process of doing the work, you're getting off track, so to speak. So the monitoring and controlling of the project work will allow us to notice that this is happening, and then create something like a corrective action that will bring us back in alignment with our baselines. And that's the essential assumption for the monitoring and controlling. However, sometimes it mightn't be possible to do because of incorrect assumptions, let's say, that were produced at the beginning of the project, or some other unrelated factors that hitherto were unknown. So in that case, we might have to change what our project entails. So rather than having this as our path, we're going to produce a different path that will hopefully bring us to the same goal. So that's why we will update project plan. Anyway, let's get over inputs, tools and techniques, and outputs. So before we go in, I guess the monitoring and controlling project work is comparing project against performance plan. So as the plan is produced, all the plans that we have. So especially I suppose the cost plan and schedule. These are the important ones against which the project performance is measured. So it's also carried out. This process carried out to determine whether any corrective or preventative actions are needed, and then recommending those if necessary. Checking the status of individual project risk, whether that status has changed from the previous review. And actually, when we talk about project risk management, we're going to talk about periodic and continuous risk management, risk assessment, and making sure that things don't change for us and bring us closer to some sort of an accident. It allows us to gather information to produce reports and produce forecasts, which is nice. You kind of want to know where you are, and from that you can develop vision on how and where you can get to in the future. Importantly, I think this is an important one. Monitoring and controlling project work allows for, I wouldn't say seamless, but allows for managed and controlled implementation of approved changes as they occur. I'm not sure exactly. I think the next process is perform integrated change control. So that's something that will be also looked at in the process of managing and controlling the project work. And obviously ensuring the project stays aligned to the business needs, because at every stage what we want is to keep in mind that the objective of the project is to bring us from some time in the present to somewhere in the future, which will increase our value. I guess will provide us with some added value of some kind, whether it's monetary or non-fungible in a way. We want to ensure that project does that. And if it turns out that the path on which the project stays is actually going to bring us over here, that's when we need to reconsider doing the project and carry out the process of carry out our portfolio management activities. But we're only going to know that if and when we're monitoring and controlling project work. Anyway, inputs into monitoring and controlling project work are outputs of scope management, schedule management, communications management, cost management, risk management, quality management, procurement management, resource management, and stakeholder management. So pretty much every knowledge area contributes to this. Project documents are also inputs into that process, and the project management plan is also an input into the process, and the outputs of the process will be put into project management plan or project documents. So that might be the updates associated with changes to the project. What else could we have? So OPAs and EFFs, they might change based on the controlling project work, and then work performance reports will be input into risks, communications, and resource management. So resource management is actually number 5. So the work performance report will go in there, and critically, the change requests and work performance reports, which are outputs of this process, will be an input to process of integrated change control. So monitoring and controlling project work is an important, integral, and critical part of the project management. So it's worth for us to make sure that we keep a clear track of what's going on in this particular process. So Grant, we have that. So inputs, obviously, we have the assumption logs, basis of estimates, cost forecasts, issue logs, these kind of things. And we also have those KPIs, key performance indicators. And these inputs are going to also be produced, are also going to, or might be rather updated as outputs. And those, the KPIs as well, which I suppose are outcomes of the processes carried out to produce these documents. So considering, for instance, quality management plan will create some level of expectation as to what the quality of what we're producing in our project should be. So we'll have some general expectation of what would be our acceptable defect levels. What kind of yields are we expecting from the products that we're producing? What kind of rejects, I'd say, what kind of complaints if it's a service, So we're going to have some key performance indicators, and then those key performance indicators are obviously going to be compared against the current project performance. So it's quite nice to have them. Anyway, work performance information, output of this process is input to all these other processes. So that's nice. So moving on along the line, where we go next. So tools and techniques, critically data analysis, I guess, because obviously as project work produces work performance data, it would be useful to create a lot of information out of that data. Data is not equivalent with information, and we need to analyze the data in order to arrive at the information. Alternative analyses will help us to choose from available options, and there are numerous techniques. There are scoring techniques, there are checkbox techniques, there are multi criteria weight scoring methods, which involve some complex algorithmic operations that produce a really well-developed hierarchy of options. You have cost benefits analysis, where you obviously it's kind of straightforward enough. You look at the costs of a given decision, you look at the benefits of a given decision, and then simply decide based on that, all things considered. Earned value analysis is an important technical, I guess, analysis type that we can carry out in order to compare project performance against schedule, really. So earned value analysis is a very useful way of controlling project schedule based on the amount of performed work and the amount of cost incurred by the organization in the process of performing work. So it's a very nice analysis technique, and it's going to be quite useful. That's what we're going to be looking at for the 25% of this module, earned value analysis for a given project. Root cause analysis, we've spoken about this at some length previously when we were talking about problem solving techniques, and both 5W and the fishbone diagram are useful tools and techniques that we can implement for root cause analysis. Trend analysis, those of you who work in process and look at performance charts and look at the measurement charts, daily measurements, obviously, like, if you have some control limits, and then sorry, this doesn't really look very well, so let me redraw. If you have some spec limits and then some control limits, and then you observe your work performance measurements and notice that the measurements tend to move in one direction only. That's a trend. So we observe trends to see whether we're getting better, I guess, or getting worse, where we're becoming outside of what's acceptable or within acceptable. And variance analysis will be carried out to see, to look for the differences against plan in this particular case. And there is a strong correlation between end value and the variance analysis that might be required. Each of those techniques could be, I guess, you could spend a week talking about them, but we don't really have time for it. So continuing on, outputs, work performance reports, change requests, updates to management plan, and project document updates. So just to maybe look at a little bit more in a little bit more detail, how work performance data can contribute to this process. So as the work is being carried out, information is being produced, information about the costs incurred, information from the measurements carried out during the process of the development of a widget cranker, what else? Information about the service that we're using, information about the code that we're developing. Information is being produced in the form of data. It's not really information. It's still hidden within the data, and then that data is an input. The data out of the direct and managed project work is then input into 10 of 12 controlling processes. So there's into quite a few processes, and out of those processes we produce work performance information, and that work performance information is an input into monitoring and controlling. So data goes into controlling, and from controlling, the information is into monitoring and controlling project work, which is nice because now we can actually see what we're doing. How are we getting on in comparison against the baselines that we have created for for our projects, and then we can produce a report that then will inform our process of project management. Might lead to change requests, or it might lead to quicker project completion. It might lead to updated project scope and so on. So as long as we know what's going on, we can react, and I think that's the fundamental need for the monitoring and controlling project work. So if we have to react, the way we're going to react is very important that we have a system in place for it. Because if we're carrying out changes to our process, we need to be able to understand whether a change that's being implemented within one area of the process. So say, for instance, change to schedule or change to the quality metrics or something like that. We need to be able to understand whether that change is going to have an impact on all the other elements of the project. And there are a lot, obviously, you know that there are 49 processes and technology areas, so there are a lot of moving parts, and those parts are interconnected in this nice and neat little web of inputs and outputs. So it would be nice to know whether what we're changing is going to have a downstream effect, and if it does, what kind of effect is that going to be. So based on that, we can create or we can plan a change that will, I suppose, that won't prevent the project from being completed. We can change things or aspects of our project in such way that the project has still a large probability of success. So obviously, if we read this definition, it's a process of reviewing change requests, approving those changes, and managing changes to the deliverables, and then also making sure that documents and the plan and are updated accordingly, that the decisions about changes are communicated. So in the integrated change control, all requests for change are reviewed and approved or rejected. And it might be done by something that's called, let's say, CRB for Change Review Board, or there might be other names, Internal Review Board or Process Review Board, or Project Review Board, I guess, depending on whether the naming convention is. But someone has to be able to review it and approve those changes. Anyway, what we're inputting into that process is project management plan, project documents, work performance reports, change requests, obviously EFs and OPAs. And we're going to use the expert judgment, the change control tools, data analyses, alternatives, and cost benefit being the principal one. Decision making, especially in if a decision is not clear, so there will be either voting or autocratic or multi-criteria analysis decision, which is a nice way of seeing a hierarchy of alternatives and meetings, which are obviously the lesser evil, let's say. As outputs, we're going to have approved change requests. So the rejected change requests obviously are not an output out of this integrated change control process, because when a change request is rejected, there is no change to be performed. And if a change request is approved, then obviously what's going to be associated with is the updates to the project management plan, so any component that is affected by the change, and project document updates and change log, because obviously it's nice to be able to note and log all the changes that we carried out in our process. So inputs, project documents, all of those. Important one is the change management plan, which specifies how we are going to deal with change that occurs during the project. So steps and procedures. It might also highlight the need for data, what kind of data is required, and in what way it needs to be presented, and so on. Like, depends on the company organization and the culture, the level of the detail. Also about on the project, I guess, because some projects might require slightly more information to carry out change. So anyway, the configuration management plan. So this document specifies how changes to any configuration of the project are going to be handled, and what the configuration is, what's the baseline, what are the components of the configuration, and so on. Scope baseline. We're going to be talking about scope in the second part of today's lecture, but scope baseline is essentially all the work that needs to be carried out for the project to be completed. Schedule baseline specifies the timelines of the project, really, in most crude terms. Cost baseline, how much money we're willing to spend and willing to have spent at any stage of the project. Basis of estimates, so the kind of ways in which estimates of quantities times work required, of costs, of timelines were carried out. The requirements traceability matrix, which is closely related to the scope baseline. Requirements inform the scope of the project. So if based on the change, if performing the integrated change control is going to prevent some of the requirements from being completed, we need to make sure that we keep track of it. So requirements traceability matrix have to be an input into this process. Risk reports, so that we understand whether there is an impact associated with the change that we perform, or so that we can update this document in a way that includes risks associated with the change. Work performance reports, which will inform the decision and the process of carrying out the integrated change control. And change requests, which are obviously the document that requests the change to be carried out in the first place. So where do those come from? From initiating, planning, executing, and monitoring and controlling. So 24 processes could produce a change request. If we look at those change requests, we have a customer, whatever that customer is at any stage of the project, that change request is then input into the project manager or project team, really, so that the change request can be created, scoped, and assessed against the constraints of time, cost, and schedule. And obviously, as this can indicate, that's done by the team, so by the stakeholders of the project. Now, while this is being assessed, the impact of the change is being, let's say, comparatively assessed of whether performing this change or not is going to be beneficial or it's going to be a disadvantage for the project. Then change, CRB, CCB, conducts meetings to look for options. Then the change control board approves change. So CCB, change control board; CRB, change review board. I suppose same thing, really, different name. Rows would be known, would still the same, smell the same thing. Anyway, approves or rejects. Doesn't, respectively of whether it's approved or rejected, it has to be added to the change log. And then once the change is approved, then the project plan needs to be updated accordingly, so that the elements of the change are included. People who are required to know, so the stakeholders, and more clearly, people who have been identified that they need to be notified about the change based on the change area, let's say, and change requirements. They need to be notified about that change. And then change is implemented into the project plan. Project plan can be carried out, and it's not the original plan, it is a new plan which implements the change, and that change should be present within the new scope baseline. So in order to carry all that out, you definitely need expert judgment and technical knowledge to understand the impacts of the changes, legal knowledge to see whether there is any legal issues with carrying out the process of that change, configuration knowledge, so that if we're changing something in the left end of the widget, whether that change is going to affect how the right end of the widget performs in a widget situation, so that we understand that everything works well. And risk management, obviously, people who are in the know about how to manage risks of introducing change, they should be a useful resource for the process of performing integrated change control. Change control tools which help us identify the change request, document it, decide on it, and track it. And they can be integrated within the OPAs, the organizational process assets. They could be ad hoc, as long as there is some sort of a procedural way defined earlier within the project management documents. On the change management plan, that would be a way to follow. Data analysis tools and decision-making tools may kind of are self-explanatory. We need to know the impacts of our change. We need to be able to decide against different options. So, and the decision-making tools, we need to be able to make decisions upon based on some changes. Some changes mightn't have the very clear winner, and under constraints of cost, schedule, we might simply have to make a decision. So, consensus making through voting, or through multi criteria choice making, can create a hierarchy of options, from which we can then select which one to follow. Has to be done, I guess. And as an output, we are going to approve a change in the project. Approve the change in the project, which is going to be implemented within the project plan and then verified through quality control once the verification is possible. And then we need to make sure that we update the change log so that we understand what change was carried out, how was it carried out, what was the initial state, what was the final state, what was the evidence. I guess this documentation is obviously going to be produced, and if you make changes into a project, change log is a way to identify and help to backtrack, type of thing, so that you can understand what's changed in the project. If the project is complicated, then a lot of people work in it. It helps people get visibility on how the project has been evolving, and that's that. Now let's see what this integration talked about. So we developed project plan. We developed the project plan. We performed the project work, and we produced whatever the project was required to produce. So now we're able to close it. And there are two ways to close it: either successfully or unsuccessfully. So while we're closing a project or a phase of a project, we need the following inputs. So we need the project charter, which roughly specifies what the project was aiming to achieve. We need the project management plan so that we can compare what we achieved against what we specified and stated that we are going to achieve. We need the documents, and there are pretty much all the documents in there, so that we can check against our baselines. We can compare and contrast and see where we got, how did we get it, and did we get where we were supposed to do. Scope baseline is a critical document in this case, this stage, and obviously it's indicated by the output of the process of validating scope. So again, this is in the scope management. So when we validate scope and we have accepted deliverables, so only after the validated scope, when we validate scope, we have an accepted deliverable. So something that the project produces that can be put into the input into close project or phase process. And then procurement documentation, agreements, business case, benefits management plan. Benefits management plan might become critical at this stage, because now we can have something out of which we can derive benefits. So that we need to understand how is this going to be achieved. And then a standard OPA and the EFFs. So OPA is actually sorry. Then the output, we have the final product, service of or result, which will have to be, I guess, will have to undergo transition from the development stage to the customer stage, and there is a process for doing that as well, or maybe part of the documentation really in a scope documents that are going to inform how that's going to be carried out. We need to update the project documents. We're in the closing stage here, and we also need to update the assets that the organization has based on the prior project performance. So the lessons learned registered, and essentially that historically documents. And then final project report will contribute to the organizational process. Assets might act as a template for a project of a similar nature in the future. And so when we think about how what goes into this project is like, you have to complete actions, you have to complete paperwork. So actions to be completed, we make sure that the acceptance is there, so that the customer actually wants to receive the product of the project, and it wants you make sure they want it. You ensure that the costs are charged and the cost centers are closed and balanced. You close accounts and reassign personnel, particularly important for project organizations and metrics organizations. The employees are just reabsorbed into their functional departments, deal with the equipment, make sure that things that activities and resources that had been in use during the performing project work are not utilized anymore, are reassigned, are recycled, are simply not a concern anymore for this particular project. You complete the paperwork, so you get you get the thing on paper saying that the product is approved. You deal with open claims, you update the records on the project, and then the company data banks. You archive info for future use, because obviously it's nice if we can refer to the past reports, so that we don't make the same mistakes and we have things a little bit easier. Auditing project might be a good idea to see what wasn't well, what didn't go so well, and how can we learn from it for the future. Project management office might take a lead on that if project management office is available, because these would be the people that would be in a position to how to say it, to develop maximum amount of reflection on the project performance and then utilize that reflection to improve the future project. And then you measure stakeholder satisfaction to see how well you've done, in opinion of people who care about what you did. So what do you input? Obviously project charter, and the project charter has rough guidelines on the success criteria for the project. Then the rest documents is fairly straightforward. And then accepted deliverables. So in the process of validating scope, we're going to produce some, we're going to have an output of something that's accepted, a deliverable out of the project, a widget, a service, a product, a process for production, something along those lines. That will also contain a number of documents related to how it performs, what are its specifications, and so on and so forth. And now we can simply bring it out to the customer. So that's another input. And then the rest, so PA, ZFF is very straightforward. So experts will judge, does the project fulfill success criteria? If you're dealing with a product of a medical drug, you might require some scientific input to understand whether the product actually performs in a way that it's supposed to, based on the performance data produced during the project work, based on the trial data, based on the reports from medical organizations or whoever people are who are responsible for producing the data. They make the judgment, and based on that, I suppose they can accept or reject the product. But like in ideal case scenario, if you carried all your due diligence out properly and you validated the scope of the project, you should already at this stage know whether what you produced in the project satisfies the requirements, which are in essence the success criteria for the project. So sorry, as the project is being closed, you get rid of the widget cranker. You can carry out the document analysis. So read the reports, figure out where the issues were, what those issues were. No, and like, people always look at the problems, but also it would be nice to note what went really well, so that you can do more of it and do less of what's not so good for you. And actually, interesting thing to note is that by doing that via negativa, by avoiding things that could go wrong, you're hugely increasing the likelihood of success of your project, which is nice thing to do when you think about it. You can look at the trends of how your project was performing against the timeline, on costs, on schedule, on procurement or work performance, on the project deliverable performance. You can look at variance analysis to see where you differed from the baselines, and then try to identify the reasons for it. So there is a lot of stuff to analyze, and again, project management office might take lead on that. If you are in a project team, you might contribute to it as well. Outputs: final product or service, excuse me, final project report, and updated organizational process assets, so project documents and lessons learned. So final report should contain a whole number of sections. I guess information in ideal case scenario would be nice. It would be nice if it contained all these, the variances, the evidence, and the evidence for satisfying the requirements, the list, the scope, the costs reports, the schedule reports, and so on. So it doesn't have to be long, but it should touch upon all those areas. And that concludes the section on project integration. So are there any questions? If there are no questions, like if you have questions, you can enter them into the chat window. But if there are no questions, I would like to take a 6 minutes break. It's 18:43, 7 minutes. It's 18:43 on my clock over here. So I will resume at 18:50, and in the next section, we're going to start talking about project scope management. So let me just pause the recording here. And as I mentioned, in this section, we're talking about the scope management of the project. I guess just as far as scope is concerned, anything that's related to project work. So the kind of boundaries about the project that we're going to that are going to limit what we're going to be doing. In other words, project scope helps us to do what we want for the project and avoid doing things that we don't want. So like the overview, really, there is 1, 2, 3, 4, 5, 6 processes in here. Planning, collecting requirements, defining scope. Then we are going to create the actual work for the project, after which we're going to validate scope once the product is, the item is being produced. And throughout the project, we're going to be controlling scope as well, making sure that what we're producing is actually what we should be producing. So as we know, the project has three constraints: cost, time, and scope. So things that we need to do, the amount of time that we have to do it, and the amount of money that we have to complete it. And within scope, there are two different ideas that I need to highlight. We have the product scope, and product scope is what we want the thing to do. So features and functions that characterize a product, service, or result. Product scope is the things that we want our widget to be able to do after the widget is produced. Whereas project scope is everything that we need to do and to complete, all the actions that we need to complete in order to produce the widget with the product scope defined. So project scope is is the way of achieving product scope. And obviously, like, there is a difference in how scope is managed depending on the approach to project lifecycle. So in a predictive lifecycle, you essentially want to plan all the scope to begin with. So you kind of know what you're doing at the beginning, and you're going to act accordingly. In agile and more iterative, in the iterative process, the scope is much more general. You create a backlog of work required to achieve scope objectives, and then you simply perform tasks from that backlog of work in a really rough sketch. So depending on the approach to the project, like project management, I mean, it doesn't really come into this discussion too much because the ideas are fairly similar. So you have a customer, the customer has some need, and that need is then going to be, I suppose, it's going to be defined in much more detail. So that when the project is started, the customer gets what they need. So in this case, customer requires some internet banking, and obviously, when they start thinking about what internet banking entails, it could be retail, corporate, loan system, currency transactions, and so on. But because we are only going to focus on retail banking, we can decide on what we're going to include and exclude based on the features or the requirements that the stakeholders have. So the requirements analysis is going to be quite important. And this information, what's included and what's excluded, is going to be contained within the in-depth project charter. It's a very rough sketch of boundaries of the project. So all this this goes into scope analysis, and it's converted into detailed requirements. So you might require yellow banner on the login and so on. These kind of things might be in there, and then based on the requirements, you end up with a specification. So for instance, you have a requirement of a quick login. Technical specification will include the login protocol, will include the fast password hashing algorithms and so on, so that the requirement and technical specification satisfies the customer needs. So there's a little bit of a journey from what customer needs to where the scope statement is. So then, to achieve the scope, we have to carry out a number of processes. And the first one, and that doesn't have, in my view, and I don't know whether this view is right or not, but I see this process doesn't necessarily have to be carried out for every project, especially if projects are fairly repetitive in their nature, like construction projects, let's say, or electronics chip development projects. Because the way of managing scope, which is essentially the focus and the concern of planning for scope management, should be the same for the same type of projects. So at the end of the at the end of the planning for scope management, you will have produced the scope management plan, so how to deal with all the scope management processes, and you will also produce a plan how to deal with the requirements and some associated documents. As an input into this plan, you need the project charter, the management plan, or the elements of the management plan, the EPAs and EFs and OPAs. So again, at the end of this project, at the end of this process of planning for scope management, you will have produced a plan to manage your scope. So there is no initiation process in here, in the scope management, but there are 5: planning, scope, collecting requirements, defining scope, and creating works breakdown structure. And then there are 2 processes for monitoring and controlling, which is validating scope and controlling scope. All the 6 processes are project scope management. So into the scope management plan, we have the following inputs: project charter, the project management plan aspects, especially the quality management plan, the life cycle description, and the development approach. So these kind of documents define and inform how we're going to be managing the scope. And quality management plan is going to be an input into how we're going to be validating scope. And the scope management plan should create a clear description of how the scope validation is going to be carried out. And scope validation is going to see whether what we produce in our project is doing what it should be doing. So that's where the quality management plan acts as an input, and then EEFs and OPAs, obviously. As an output, we're going to have scope management plan. How are we going to manage the scope of the project, which is how are we going to deal with defining the scope, how are we going to deal with the work breakdown structure, how are we going to deal with the validating and controlling scope. So to do it, expert judgment is ideal for knowledge of similar work in the past, because then you know how to deal with the scope management in that case. And that will also come out of the functional groups. So functional head knowledge might be a useful thing to add. Data analysis includes alternatives analysis, statistical analysis, design selections. So all those could be inputs into this. Meetings are important, and I would highlight kickoff meeting as the key thing in here, because kickoff meeting is going to set the tone for a lot of your project development, I guess. So kickoff meeting is an important part of the planning for scope management. As an output, we're going to produce a document which will detail how scope was prepped, what's going to go into the work, how work will be tracked, what will it be tracked against. We're going to figure out the requirement management plan. The requirement is essentially all the stakeholders needs of what the project should produce. And we're also going to produce configuration management. So how are the changes in the configuration going to be handled? How is the reporting on those changes going to be handled? And how are we going to analyze impact? So now that we have the plan, we can start again getting into the rest of this knowledge area. So we can start collecting requirements. And again, for collecting requirements, we have inputs from project charter. The project management plan includes the scope management plan in this as well. Already, we have requirements management plan as another input into this, and stakeholder engagement plan, because stakeholders are going to be individuals or groups who are going to be defining the requirements. Then assumption log, lesson learned, and stakeholder register are critical input, the project documents that are required for this. And then the rest is kind of documentation that might be of lower value but still required and needed. Then tools and techniques, expert judgment, brains, data gathering. So kind of focusing on collecting requirements from the stakeholders, data analysis to analyze the documents that might be produced in the process of the data gathering, decision making, and that's critically important to how to prioritize the requirements. Data representations, affinity diagrams, which will allow us to group requirements in certain families, and mind mapping to create the visual representation of relationships between the requirements. And then context diagram, which might indicate a way, I guess, for a thing to be produced, something like a process map within a process. Prototypes, which are kind of self-explanatory. And as an output, we're going to have some requirement documentation and the requirement traceability matrix. All right, so to get the requirements, we identify who are the stakeholders to be contacted. So these guys, which we want to make sure that we want to hear their view of what this project or the product or the output of this project should include. So now we're going to start collecting the requirements, and the scope management plan is going to define a way in which we're going to be, collecting the requirements. So, face-to-face meetings, letters, surveys, whatever it is, as long as we get the requirements into our list, that would be good. A good example of kind of unrelated really to technical stuff, but a good example of how requirements are being collected is the engagement that National Curriculum Council had with the stakeholders in the current process or in the current project of updating the leaving certificate. There is a nice record of conversations and engagements between the curriculum reform team, let's say, and the people who are interested in the Living Cert reform. So students, parents, schools, and universities. And they had their say and their input into what they would expect. So these are the requirements, what they want from the new Living Cert. Now those requirements are, documented and characterized as functional and non-functional. So now we know what are functional, these kind of ones that will have an impact towards your project. Then you review requirements for gaps to see whether you need something else in your project plan or not. Create traceability matrix so that you know where the requirement came from, who is it related to, and then you review the fixes to approve the project and input this into the scope management plan so that you can actually have a better understanding of what the scope of work is now that you know what's required. So the requirements will inform in many ways how your product and project output is going to look. So now you get your sponsors and higher ups, let's say the management, to approve the requirements, and then you finalize them to start putting them into fruition and into life. So types of requirements. So business requirements, the needs and reasons why the project is being undertaken. We have stakeholders requirements connected to specific groups, like a need of truck drivers for the, I think it was it the port tunnel to be tall enough for trucks to be sufficiently for the port tunnel to be sufficiently high for the trucks to enter. That would be requirement of those stakeholders. I don't think it was satisfied. I think there was an issue with that. Anyway, solution requirements, so functions and features of the project, which are non-functional. So something like serviceability, maintenance. So, you know, if you're producing a widget, a solution requirement would be, for instance, something like modularity, that the widget parts can be plugged out and replaced within, you know, 10 minutes or something like that. So that's another requirement that that the end user might have. And then transitory requirements are related to the I suppose the after the project is closed and the product is produced and it's going from the project team to the customer. Um, the customer might have requirements related on how that transition process is going to be carried out. So maybe there is going to be a requirement for a period of training. Maybe there is going to be some requirement for facilitation of a given widget cranker and so on. So those transitory requirements are also going to be produced and gathered from the stakeholders so that the project team can prep for it. Because say you produce the widget cranker that the customer wants, but without the transitory process or planning for transition, it mightn't end up with the same level of acceptance as if it would if those requirements were satisfied to begin with. So what we're inputting in the collecting requirements is the charter, the documents, business documents, the business agreements, and the EFFs and OPAs. And we produce the project documents of requirement documentations and requirement traceability matrix. So what are we going to use for it? For data gathering, two methods, Crawford-Slip method and Delphi method. Useful for brainstorming to not talk before everybody had an opportunity to write down their ideas, because as soon as somebody talks, they might frame the discussion towards a particular direction, which might minimize the amount of useful ideas produced. Interviews for direct collection requirements, focus groups for a kind of direct collection requirements of high volume, because you're going to interview a lot of people at the same time. Questionnaires and surveys are quick and cheap, but they mightn't be as clear cut in terms of their data quality, might not produce anything valuable. And then benchmarking to compare against best in class. If you're creating a widget cranker and company B already has a widget cranker that cranks slightly different widgets than you're planning on, you might just take a look at what it looks like so that you're not worse than that. So that would be benchmarking B. Then you analyze the documents, the brainstorming ideas, the interview transcripts, the focus group interview transcripts, the surveys, and so on. You analyze the documents for list to produce list or requirements. Then you you know, I suppose you will have to make some decisions on which requirements to prioritize, and maybe you will have to make decisions on how those requirements might be satisfied within the constraints of the project. You know, so the decision making also has to be used for this particular process. For that representation, you're going to create Venn diagrams which might show you which of the requirements go together, and mind maps which connects puts a visual relationship between different ideas. Context diagram is a visual depiction of scope, and then prototypes are very straightforward. So this would be a context diagram for production of I think some glass fibers or something such. So you know, you will start with raw material, go through all these processes, and then you end up with a produced material. So that's a context diagram. It's a sort of a process flow and what's going to be happening within the scope. It's a visual representation of what the scope will be and how the requirements might be satisfied within the scope. And then as outputs, we have the requirements documentation. So all the documentation, all the requirements are collected and listed, and then the requirements documentation becomes a reference point for all the requirements in hand and how the requirements meet the business need for the project. And then traceability matrix links the requirements from their origin to the deliverables that satisfy them. So we know where is the requirement from, what is the requirement, and then the product deliverable that will satisfy that requirement. And if you decide that the requirement isn't going to be satisfied, then we might just mention this here as well. So there's and I guess template for one requirement traceability matrix. You have the requirement description, the business need, opportunity, and the goals objective associated with that requirement. Then the objectives that are linked to that requirement or rather satisfy that requirement. Then which WBS work breakdown structure deliverables satisfy those objectives. Then the design, development, and test cases. The documents that could be related to that project process, I guess. Those activities. So, right. So now we have requirements. So now we can start defining scope. And once we define scope, we're going to have project scope statement, which is essentially the statement of work, what we're going to be doing. And then we're going to update documents, the assumption log about our project, the requirements, documentation, traceability matrix might be updated based on the scope definition, and then the stakeholder register. So, at the beginning of the requirements, traceability matrix, we're going to have requirements, ID descriptions, and maybe business needs that are satisfying the requirements. At the end of this, we're going to fill out all the other columns. So, when we produce and define scope, when we carry out the process of scope definition, we are ensuring that the requirements are within the scope. We have the requirements converted into technical specifications, and then we're going to list risks, assumptions, and constraints, which is nice. So on the left-hand side of this red line, we have scope management. So the requirements which input into definition of the scope, and then the scope will produce a technical specification, which is the scope statement for the project. On the other side, we have the integration management. So in the integration management, we're going to have a project charter, which is going to create a very rough outline of what the project should include and exclude. And those two things talk to each other, because if the scope statement, if we're assuming that scope statement is produced, we should satisfy the included excluded elements of the scope from the project charter, which I suppose indicates that we should think carefully about what we're going to include and exclude in the project charter, and maybe we need to, upon careful analysis of the requirements, maybe there is some scope pardon my pun, some scope for the scope updates as it's presented in the charter, but I wouldn't be suggesting that lightly. So once you have that, that's all right. We're inputting all this into the defining scope definition, and we're outputting project scope statement, and we're outputting project document updates. So that's nice. Once we have all that done, we know what we're going to be doing within the project. So that's good. And to do that, we're going to obviously use expert judgment for business analysis, for system analysis, especially if the if we require some domain specific knowledge in order to produce technical specification for the project deliverables. So anyone who can convert technical or business requirement into a meaningful, complete, and valid specification will be an expert that might be required for this particular process. So we're going to use that analysis to, if we have requirements and we have alternative specifications that satisfy the requirements, we're going to have to decide which to choose, and we're going to have to apply the facilitation skills in order to ensure that the experts contribute to scope scope statement in a meaningful fashion. And then we're going to have to do product analysis, so look at the technical features and details of the project objective and output. We're going to figure out how to engineer the value. We're going to have to break down the project. We're going to have to engineer systems to the project. So there is a lot of technical knowledge that goes into the scope statement. It's a very technical part of the project management, or could be rather, depending on the domain within the project within which the project is run. So as an output, we're going to have a scope statement, which is the detailed specification document, which breaks down technical and functional rules for the project. And those rules can be used during the execution stage to make exactly what is needed. So, if we know what if in our scope definition we state what does our widget cranking do, then in the project performing project work, we can make the widget cranker that does exactly what expected. We'll have all the exclusion and inclusions in detail. It might contain risk assumptions, constraints, if they affect the specs, and also should contain a list of deliverables and acceptance criteria. So that's nice to know that the scope statement states what we need to achieve, and we update the assumptions. So the assumptions that we had while we were putting together all those technical requirements, we update the requirement documentation in order to indicate how the requirements were used and converted into technical specification. That's also going to have to go into the traceability matrix, and then stakeholder register, so that we can track which requirement from which stakeholder is going to be satisfied by which technical specification, which is nice to do. Then we're going to go into the tremendously important process of creating the work breakdown structure, which is a hierarchical decomposition of the scope and deliverables of the project. And there is a couple of rules that I'm going to state for the work breakdown structure that might seem counterintuitive, but I think that using them is going to be fairly valuable. So what the WBS does, it breaks down deliverables into smaller, more manageable components. So if you have a widget cranker, you're going to break the widget cranker into the casing, into the engine or power supply, I guess, into the cranking components, and then into the transition system. I don't know, whatever goes into widget crankers. You essentially break it apart, and it breaks down, the what's documented in the requirements and project scope statement into something that's manageable. So whatever the requirements and deliverables are, those are going to be broken down until such time that the minimum viable deliverable is obtained. So inputs are as follows. We have the scope management plan. So how the scope management plan helps us with knowledge how the WBS is to be created. Then scope statement requirements documentation are going to clearly inform the deliverables that work breakdown structure needs to contain. And then EAFs and OPAs, obviously, self-explanatory. OPAs, how the work breakdown structures have been created in the past. Expert judgment and decomposition will be the tools and techniques. And then as the output, we're going to create scope baseline and project documents update. Scope baseline is a document which defines project work and how that project work is going to be, I guess, related to each other. A true work breakdown structure, and then assumption log and requirements documentation is going to be updated so that for each of the requirements, within requirements list and requirements traceability matrix, for each of the requirements, which work package, which is the minimum viable deliverable within the work breakdown structure, which work package is responsible for which requirement and deliverable. And that helps us to track it very clearly. So an example of work breakdown structure is given. And note a couple of things. You have a project deliverable, so somebody's birthday. Then within that, to arrive at the deliverable, you need to produce cake, you need to produce food, you need to produce decorations, and so on. Within cake, you need to produce or have size, shape, and flavor. You need to have candles, you need to have plates, you need to have napkins and spoons within cake only. So so let's think about it the other way. For the deliverable of that person's birthday, you need to have a deliverable of cake, And for the deliverable of cake, you need to satisfy the deliverables of size, shape, and flavor, deliverable of candles, deliverable of disposable plates, napkins, spoons, and so on. So we're identifying the deliverables that are required to satisfy deliverable of a higher level. There are a couple of rules that I would like to indicate as a good practice. Would be nice to follow them. So it always should be a picture and a diagram rather than a list of words. We need to know, you need to be able to read out from the diagram the relationships between the elements of the work breakdown structure. If it has to be many pages, it has to be many pages, but as long as there is a meaningful meaningful representation of the structural relationships between different levels. So that's one of the requirements. No activities. So what that means is that we only need to have nouns, no verbs. Like in this particular word breakdown structure, I could say bake the cake, but that's baking the cake is an activity. As an output of that activity, we're going to have a cake as a deliverable. It's more important to put the deliverable than to put the activity. We're going to be using deliverables from the work packages in order to create activities that will then go into our schedule management. So into our activity diagram and so on. But into the work breakdown structure, we're putting just nouns, no verbs. Major deliverables are going to be present on the first level. Then, so let's say, in this case, this is the first level, this is the second level. And note that once I identified this deliverable, and I would spend time just focusing on this deliverable only until I have broken it down into its minimum required deliverables. Okay, so candles, for instance, you might need two deliverables of candle, maybe not candle, or like 4 candles deliverable, purchase a candle. For disposable plates, activity of purchasing disposable plates, and so on. So these are my minimal viable. But for this one, size, shape, flavor, that could be broken up into this size, cake shape, cake flavor, and we could change this particular derivable into the look of cake, or flavor of cake, or the something around those lines. Cake experience. Each main deliverable should be broken down completely before moving on. Critically, if you're doing the work breakdown structure, stakeholders should take part because it's going to be the stakeholders that are going to have sufficient amount of knowledge required in order to break down each deliverable into meaningful work packages. Then work breakdown structure of a past project can be reused for a current one if the project is similar. Critical and the important one, the lowest sub-level of work breakdown structure is called work package. Now, for different deliverables, the work packages could exist at different levels. So in this case, if we have let's say 2 major deliverables, which first major deliverable will have 1 minor and 2 even minor deliverables. So this will be a work package, this will be a work package, and this will be a work package as well, even though those work packages exist at different levels. However, each of those work packages will allow us to satisfy a deliverable for a given level. So that's why all of those indicate work packages. And again, work package is not activity or a task. It's a deliverable. So within that deliverable, then through activities in different knowledge areas of project management, we're going to identify activities required for reaching the deliverable that's required. Okay, so nouns, not verbs. What do we input? Well, project management plan and mainly scope management plan, so that we know how the work breakdown structure is to be created. Project documents, the scope statement will inform us on the requirements and associated deliverables for the requirements. And those deliverables will be the top level deliverables for the project. We're going to be breaking them down into lower level then. And the requirements documentation again, because we'll be updating that. Regulation compliance culture, so that when we break things down, they match our environment and our company. Policies for breaking things down, templates for the work breakdown structures, lessons learned, how to break things down for work packages, how to deal with difficulties in breaking down work packages, maybe some lessons learned about previous work packages and so on. Useful information. So expert judgment is going to be critical because if somebody knows something that's helpful in creating work breakdown structure, they should be used. Technical expert, consultants, functional heads, team leaders, quality managers, whoever knows most about a given deliverable area and is available as a resource, that would be nice to do. The composition means that we're going to break down the major deliverables until the lowest and smallest are available. So deliverables again, no activities. And the level of the composition is usually decided by the level of granularity at which the project needs to be controlled, which means that if the project needs to be controlled very tightly, then deliverables that might be delivered by a single engineer might be defined at the work breakdown structure level. If it's something that doesn't need to be controlled as tightly, then you might just have like deliverables one level lower than the major deliverables that will be defined in the work breakdown structure, and then project team would figure out how to carry out activities aimed at delivering those deliverables. Anyway, so these are tools and techniques and outputs. We're going to have a scope baseline. So, okay, this is what we have in scope baseline. Product scope is the sum of all the requirements and the deliverables. So product scope is essentially telling us what we're going to make, how what we're going to make is going to satisfy the requirements, and which of the features of the product is going to satisfy those requirements. So that's good. But then project scope translates the product requirements into work that's required to achieve them, and work breakdown structure provides the information on how to get there. So together, the scope, and the work breakdown structure creates the scope baseline. So then one more element, which is created as a part of the scope baseline, is the work breakdown structure dictionary. So that's a document which puts more details about the work packages, because obviously in the work breakdown structure, as I mentioned, it's a graphical representation. You might just have a box with 7.5.1, which is your work package ID, and then the work package name will be crank for widget cranker or whatever it is. So that's the work from work breakdown structure, but that will translate into 7.5.1. Crank will give us a name, will give us estimated schedule, will give us estimated cost, will give us person responsible, and so on. So things like duration, risk, scope, cost, they would go into the work breakdown structure dictionary if those things are known. And then we're going to update assumption logs and the documentation of requirements so that the requirements are now linked into work packages, if they can be. So total scope consists of project scope and project scope. So project scope is measured against specifications, project scope is measured against project plan, and scope baseline is scope statement, which is kind of daily in this area. So we have scope statement plus work breakdown structure plus the dictionary. So that's scope baseline, and that is what you're going to be controlling and comparing against. So we have a scope baseline. Now, validating scope. I'm going to skip this and come back to this in a second. I want to go over the control scope first. So once you know what the project scope baseline is, you can really start carrying out the project work, because that's kind of where you need to be in order to be able to start doing the work. So as you're doing the work, it would be nice to see whether what you're doing is what you should be doing to deliver the deliverables that you require. So that will help you to ensure that you're going direction and that requirements are adhered to, that they satisfy the specification documentation, and that they do what they're supposed to be doing. So that's nice. And controlling scope ensures that the deliverables are as per the requirements. And if it turns out that what we're doing is not satisfying the requirements, we can raise the change request to perform integrated change control if it's needed, so that we can change the scope and we can deal with those, deal with the change requests. So inputs are many. tools, mainly data analysis and outputs, work performance information on how we're performing against the scope baseline, change requests, with which we might have to deal with through the integrated change control. We might update project plan if it so required through the controlling scope activities, and we can update the project documents. So what do we input? Project management plan. So scope management plan defines how the scope will be controlled. It specifies the key performance indices. It specifies the level of reporting. It specifies who might be responsible. So again, this is the scope management plan, the first plan that we created in this knowledge area. Requirements management plan, change management plan, configuration management plan. They are the kind of auxiliary plans that help us deal, maybe without the change management plan, but they help us deal with changes to the stated elements of the project, the requirements, the configuration, if there is a configuration documentation for a given product, and if we're going to carry out change uh, within our project, then we need to be able to deal with that change through change management plan. And also we're going to measure performance against baseline. Documents, work performance data, OPAs, EAFs, standard stuff. So tools and techniques, variance analysis will tell us whether where we are right now is where we should be. So difference between the plan and the performance, and trends, whether if we're carrying out this activity at numerous points along the project, we can look at the trends to see whether where we're at is continuing along the same direction as it had been. So whether we are continuing to be good, whether the project is improving, or whether it's getting worse. So that's what trend analysis will tell you, or tell us rather. So then if we deal with trend analysis, we can produce the outputs. So work performance information on how the project and the product is performing against the scope baseline, and critically scope variances. So if there is something different than expected, if we know the causes for those expectations, if there are any perceived impact of those variances, and if we can forecast this for future project performance. Now, if it turns out that based on the current work performance information, we realize that the variances are so severe that we might have to introduce change, or some of the issues showing up indicate that we might have to raise change to change scope, we are going to produce a change request, which is then going to be handled through perform integrated change control. And then as we are continuing, we have to we're going to be managing the updating scope management plan. We're going to be updating scope baseline. We're going to be updating cost and performance. So kind of the way I think about it is this: if this box is this process, the control scope, this is going to create a change request. That change request is going to be then input into the perform integrated change request. So that's CR, and that is going to be carried out along this line, and it's going to produce document updates. So as a result of scope controlling scope, we might have to update these documents here. Baseline, the schedules, the cost baselines, through change requests. And they were updating documents, lessons learned, requirements, requirement documentations, and so on. And then we can go back to, can we go back? Let me just see. Yeah, we can go back to scope validation. So when we validate scope, essentially what we're going to be doing is that as we produce deliverables that are required by the project, we're going to confirm that the deliverables satisfy the requirements as specified within the scope baseline. So what are we going to need for this? The project management plan documents, the project documents, the deliverables, which is the things that we produce, and the work performance data of those deliverables. We're going to inspect and then make decisions whether those deliverables satisfy the requirements, the technical specifications, and then we're going to either release those deliverables as accepted deliverables to a closing project, or we're going to perform integrated change request in order to, I suppose, deal with the deliverables that have been rejected. So, project management plan will specify procedure for acceptance, and that procedure will acceptance of the deliverables and of the scope, I guess, and that will be specified within the scope management plan. We're going to have requirements management plan, so that we can compare our deliverable against those requirements, and obviously we're going to be comparing those deliverables against our scope baseline. Inputs, also lessons learned, quality reports. Quality reports will be integrated into our validation process, and then requirements traceability matrix, so that again we can uh, so that we know which requirements, which technical specifications each deliverable is satisfying, and then work performance data, obviously. So as you produce deliverables, those deliverables are going to undergo the quality control. Then the quality control releases them to us. So that's when we validate those deliverables against our technical specifications, so that we know that what we produce is not only good and works, but also works within the technical specifications that we are requiring by our project scope baseline. So now if we have a validated scope, very nice, we can release those deliverables to close project or phase of the process. We're going to inspect or make decisions. So inspection, obviously, the verified deliverables, we'll have some customer who looks against requirements to inspect the deliverables. And then if they are accepted, that's good. If not, they're rejected, or which means that you have to rework the whole deliverable, or they're sent to through change request to change something about them, let's say. So that's nice. If they're inspected and satisfied, if they're validated and they satisfied the technical specification and the requirements of the project to the product, and they can be released for the project close. So as output, we're going to have an accepted deliverable, which will go into close project or phase, or change requests, which are going to be dealing with deliverables that have not been accepted. Obviously, those will have to be performed through the change request process. We're going to have information about the progress of deliverables and the acceptance through work performance information, and then we're going to update all the projects, risk registers, lesson learned, requirements, and so on and so forth. Okay. And we have spoken about controlling scope already. So that's 1936, 1.5 hours. I'm going to stop the recording right now.